Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. Scott Nichol speaking from Canberra. I work at Geoscience Australia. I'm a coastal geologist, speaking today on coastal erosion. And I'd like just to acknowledge my co-authors on the report, James Sexton, Gareth Davies, and Martin Wolfall from Geoscience Australia as well. I'm going to touch on very briefly three key components that relate to coastal erosion, the causes from a slightly technical point of view, just to put the responses that we need to make to coastal erosion into some context of the physical environment that we're working with. The impacts, of course, will be self-evident as we go through some of the examples, and then a set of three solutions which are typically recognised as options for dealing with coastal erosion. And as I go through this, I just point out that the focus of the short presentation today is on coasts which are sandy, i.e. they're made up of sand to gravel type sediments, which are highly mobile. They're also areas where we typically see a lot of human infrastructure settlement for a whole range of reasons due to recreational amenity, access to the coast and so on. So these are all examples from sandy coasts. Our report touches on other coastal types briefly as well. And the first point really is the fact that coasts change. And this is something that is recognised well and truly in the literature. And we can document that variability, which in some coasts can be quite extensive. We can document that variability of a coastline quite easily. So this is one of the first key points in terms of developing toolkits for measuring change. This example here shows an island, a sand island, from New Zealand in this case. And the left-hand side of the screen shows a series of maps of the position of that island as mapped by GPS instruments. So this is a very standard, rapid tool that we can use to capture the information, to capture the data, to document the scale of change, and then put that into the context of the erosive impact of that change and any property loss that may be associated with it. The top right graph shows the cross-sectional profile or shape of that same beach system, and then in the lower right you see a photo of that locality which is clearly eroding. So it's important to document this variability, and it can be done easily and at low cost. With that variability in mind, it's important to think about some of the factors that influence the change of a coastal position and that may lead to coastal erosion. And it's illustrated here in this simple schematic diagram, which shows that on the left-hand side we have the location or the shape of the beach. Of course, that in the case of coastal erosion, that shape is and that location is moving inland in general terms, and that is influenced by sediment supply. That is the amount of sand coming and going onto that beach, and it's influenced by wave energy. Over the long term, it's also influenced by sea level change, but we're not really thinking about that in this context. The key context is wave energy and storm events, which of course are associated with rapid changes in wave energy in the form of what we know as storm surge. So a couple of points quickly on storm surge to put that into a physical context and to understand it as episodes which impact our coasts. On some coasts, those episodes can be closely spaced in time, separated by months or years, and that can lead to long-term net erosion. So it's important again to document the changing conditions and the wave conditions of our coastline through understanding patterns of storm surge behaviour. And this shows in schematic terms, in very simple terms, what happens to a beach during a storm event when storm surge leads to the elevation of the sea level. So in that top part of the diagram, you go from sea level 1 to sea level 2. And that is driven by two key processes. One thing we call atmospheric pressure setup, that is combined with wind setup. In simple terms, we're talking about strong onshore winds driving the sea surface higher and further landward. And of course, on top of that, we have large waves. And the outcome of that, of course, is sediment removal from the upper beach and erosion, with the consequences for property quite clear. Now, it's important to think of storm surge as having varying impacts depending on our coastal elevation. Obviously, storm surge is much more of a natural hazard on low-lying coasts, as shown in this example from the United States following Hurricane Katrina in 2006, which had a storm surge, a huge storm surge of 10 metres, completely flooded across that low-lying coastline on that barrier coast and led to coastal erosion of the scale you can see there, several tens of metres, and of course property loss. In contrast, steeper gradient, high gradient coasts don't experience the impacts of storm surge as much. The other key part of a conceptual toolkit to have when dealing with and thinking of management strategies to the risk of coastal erosion is to think of our beaches in terms of what we call coastal compartments. A very useful management tool in terms of developing management strategies for a particular section of coast. It allows one to allocate resources to a particular compartment and deal with the problem within that compartment. So it's a very handy structure. Fortunately, we can map these compartments at using standard tools, air photos, spatial data sets that my team Wolf's presentation touched on earlier. So this diagram, which I won't go into at length, shows what we call the sand prism. Within the sand prism, of course, we have our beach and perhaps sand dune systems behind it, and further seaward we have, in many cases, nearshore sandbars, which are all part of the story and need to be thought about when thinking about responses to coastal erosion. The inputs and outputs are all what influence the volume, the size, and the condition and the changeability of that sand prism, from longshore transport, erosion from cliffs, delivery of sand by wind, and so on. Some compartments are closed, that is, they have a finite amount of sand, and that's a very important thing to understand for coastal erosion management, and that is if the resource is finite, you need to potentially replace it if it's being lost through erosion. So that's done through some of the mechanisms I'll talk about later. Quickly, zooming down to an actual example of a coastal compartment mapped here. The point here is these compartments can be mapped as desktop studies relatively easily with appropriately guided principles in terms of mapping. And here you can identify your pathways for sediment movement, whether it be in and out of around a compartment headland, whether it be on shore through wind, and so on. So that example from Western Australia shows a clearly defined coastal compartment with offshore reefs, which allows then management strategies to be dealt with in terms of, or to be developed in terms of thinking about how much sand needs to be brought into that coastline if it were to be eroding. In Australia, we have mapped these coastal compartments nationally. A very handy, consistent, nationally consistent approach to setting up information bases and databases to describe coastal compartments and the sand prisms within them. The point here is not to go into the detail of those, is to say that this was done as a desktop study. So this is based on air photos and even satellite images. Even using Google Earth in itself can be a handy approach to defining our boundaries and nearshore sand prisms as a first pass estimate. So with that technical detail touched on, I just want to move in the second part of the talk to the responses that we may think about for dealing with an eroding shoreline, and there are three. The first is to undertake some engineering approach to what we call hard stabilisation of the shoreline. That is simply to build something to interrupt the erosion, be it a seawall, a groin, or a breakwater. The second type is soft stabilisation, commonly referred to as beach replenishment or beach nourishment, which I'll come to the examples shortly. And the third option is quite simply to strategically relocate or retreat any property infrastructure from that eroding shoreline. They all have their pluses and minuses, which I'll go into now. Hard stabilisation, seawalls and so on. The advantages there is that undoubtedly probably the most dependable way to save beachfront property and structures associated with it. However, it can be detrimental to the recreational quality of beaches, particularly on high-use beach areas, as you'll see an example in a moment. They can reduce beach access. They're definitely costly. These structures are typically in the millions of dollars to construct, and some might argue that they're not particularly attractive, and in turn do reduce the recreational amenity of a shoreline. Here's an example from eastern United States where it's having the desired effect of protecting those set of properties on the left, but we have completely lost our recreational amenity in the beach form. In this instance, in fact, the presence of the seawall has added to the loss of sand from the system, but it is having the desired effect and clearly costly though. In some instances, those hard structures of, say in this case again from the eastern US, showing a groin midway along this beach system, which is having the desired effect of catching sand that is being transported by longshore drift. However, downstream effects are in a sense negative, in that we are seeing this shoreline continuing to erode and retreat at a faster rate than before the jetty was constructed. So there are often downstream effects of these sorts of structures which need to be considered. And coming back to the coastal compartments idea, understanding compartments and sources and pathways of sand movement will allow us to better predict and manage these sorts of responses. And in some instances, these hard stabilisation structures are simply not effective in this example here. Soft stabilisation, beach replenishment, beach nourishment. Quite simply here, it widens our beach rapidly. You can achieve nourishment within a matter of days to weeks, and in doing so, it protects the beach itself and anything behind it in terms of buildings and structures. The downside here is the beach replenishment efforts are temporary and are costly as well. At the scale that need to be done, you're again dealing with millions of dollars. An example here from Florida showing a nearshore barge pumping sand ashore to protect property. The issue here, in many cases, and we have a case in Australia here where the beaches of Adelaide are managed in this way very effectively. However, it's a recurring process. Here's an example from showing an eroding shoreline and a seawall in place that required nourishment, but with subsequent storms, that sand has gone again. So it's a recurring effort. It's effective, but it requires continued investment to deal with that particular risk. And finally, relocation or retreat of a shoreline. This is a realistic response to sea level rise and ongoing storm surge impacts. We abandon the beach effectively from using it as a location for structures. We save our structures and we preserve our buildings. However, for obvious this is politically difficult, costly, and in a sense we're giving up land. So this is often a tactic which can take decades to put in place. But we are starting to see it being used in some locations. So finally, my take-home messages in terms of putting words into actions regarding coastal erosion. The solutions and the ones I've touched on today, it's important that they integrate and consider both the management of human actions, people management, and that recognition of what I call the coastal process, which I've touched on through this presentation. And the second key point, the data collection is critical, very important to developing the appropriate response to an eroding shoreline, and it can be done at relatively low cost in terms of the data collection, monitoring of beach profiles to understand that dynamic change, mapping compartments as management units, and quite simply, accurate field observations to understand the coastal landforms that we're trying to manage. And with that, I would end and pass back to you. Thank you.